When we look at sculpture that comes down to us from the prehistoric era, the Lion Man is kind of an outlier. What is much more common is to find sculpture that depicts animal forms or the female figure. And here we are looking at one of those, the woman from Willendorf, also known as the Venus from Willendorf. The Venus title kind of represents a problematic, confusing part of its history, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It was found in Austria and dates from about 24,000 BCE. It's made from limestone, which is a hard stone but can be carved fairly easily and polished, and then painted with red ochre. And you can see a little bit of that pigment that still remains, especially in this hairstyle or headdress, and a little bit around the arms. Red ochre is a substance, a pigment that can be found. It's kind of clay-like, and it can be collected and pressed together with your hands. And then it can be, small balls of it can be used kind of as crayon, or it can be mixed with water, and a wash can be painted on an object. And that's probably what we're looking at here, is that it was once covered with a red ochre wash. It is monumental in feel, in its presence, but as you can see, it's only 4 3/8 inches high. And this is what's kind of misleading sometimes about our history lectures and the scale of the objects that you see, is that they can seem enormous, but actually it's very misleading. This object is so small that actually it could be held in your hand. And I happen to have a nice little candle that one of my students gave me. I think she got it from Elwood Thompson. It's made out of beeswax. And I measured this. This is about 5 inches high, so it's slightly larger than the real thing. But you can tell that not only is it meant to be handheld in that it can fit in your hand, but it actually feels really nice in your hand. It's almost kind of ergonomically correct. There's something about the kind of form of it, the curves and the heft of it, that feels right when you are looking at it in your hand from the front. If you turn it over, it doesn't feel quite as right. But the object is clearly meant to be picked up and handled. And this is very important because at this time in the Upper Paleolithic period, an object like this should be portable. People are still nomadic, moving from place to place. And, if you create a work of art or an object like this and it means something to you, you want to be able to take it with you. And it is highly portable because of its size. More views of the woman from Willendorf. We see that frontal view. If you look at it from a slight side, 3/4 view in the middle, you can get a better sense of some of the features, particularly the arms that are resting on the large breast. It's carved from stone, which means that it is a subtractive method. So this means that the maker is carving away all of the stone that does not belong to the figure, and what's left of is the figure that's released from the stone, as opposed to an additive method, which would be molded. So it's not molded from clay, but rather carved from stone. So we should think about what the artist has chosen to emphasize here. The figure has large breasts, a swollen belly, large thighs, and it ends at sort of stumpy little feet. Whether the feet broke off or they're just not being emphasized, we don't know. The arms are folded and resting on top of these large breasts. You can see that better from the side. The face is kind of non-existent, actually totally non-existent. We don't see facial features. However, we see a lot of emphasis placed on a headdress or a hairstyle, perhaps a woven hat of some kind, or braids if it's a hairstyle. So this tells us a lot about what the artist wanted to project in this object. The emphasis is on the sexual organs or features of this figure. The breasts are emphasized, and graphically we see the genitalia emphasized. And what we'll notice, and forgive me for getting very up and personal with this figure, there is a triangle and a little slit and then a semicircle. And this graphic, or rather geometric projection, this visual imagery is typical when representing female genitalia. On the other hand, by comparison, the features that are not gender specific, or rather gender neutral, the face, the arms, the legs, these are not particularly emphasized. So this has suggested to historians that the figure represents some kind of object of fertility, given that the features that have to do with fertility are emphasized. Some historians have also theorized that she might be pregnant. That, I think, is very difficult to prove or disprove, but I think it's clear that there is a fullness, a fleshiness that has to do with the kind of health and fecundity that a large belly projects. She is an abstracted figure in that way. There is no specificity or identity particular to her. We don't see facial features. And most of these sculptures of women are like this. They tend to emphasize, again, the femaleness of the figure rather than any particular individual. And it's been suggested that perhaps this is true because it might be a matriarchal society, or that there is kind of a supernatural power that is associated with the ability to create life that women had or have. But at the time, it would have seemed much more magical in that there wasn't really an understanding of how this happened. A woman might start to gain weight, and then eventually there was a lot of pain and there was a lot of blood, and then a child appeared. And this was considered a sort of magical thing that was specific to women. We now, of course, know that that's not particularly, completely true, but it was kind of, this object seems to be harnessing or trying to harness the power that is contained within the female figure. And this probably has to do with, how it got the title of Venus, which of course is not would have not been the belief system of the prehistoric era, but is really part of the Greek and Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses. But this kind of fertility projected in the attributes of the female figure is what gave it its name at one point. There's also been a suggestion that this figure might represent some kind of mother goddess associated with agriculture and fertility of the earth. It's hard to say whether this is true or not. I tend to not believe that, given that this is from the Upper Paleolithic period before the Neolithic Revolution, which means that agriculture wasn't really a thing at this point. But again, we don't really know. It was painted red, and this is another argument that it might represent fertility. The red is associated with the blood, life-giving force, menstruation, and so this might also imply the idea of fertility. But what's important when we look at prehistoric art is to remember that we do not know any of this. We are making educated guesses. We are looking at evidence that we do have from the time period and making assumptions. We don't know anything about the belief systems of these societies. There are other female sculptures that share some of the same attributes. Here I'm showing you the Venus of La Salle, and you'll notice again, people want to call this a Venus, but it has no association with that whatsoever. But we see some of the same features: large, pendulous breasts, a swollen belly, swollen thighs, these skinny little arms, no facial features. This figure seems to be holding a bowl or perhaps a horn of some kind. It's not uncommon to see these features emphasized. However, not all female sculptures are like this. And this kind of makes sense because the kind of heftiness, the fullness, the fleshiness of this figure probably would not have been a common body type. At the time, you were happy to have a meal a day, a small meal a day. There wasn't this surplus of food that would lead to someone looking that healthy and fleshy. Probably a more common body type would have been skinny or athletic. And we see again in this sculpture called The Woman from Ostrava Petrovice from the Czech Republic, made around 23,000 BCE. We see a much more svelte, skinny body type. But again, the femaleness is still emphasized with large breasts that are very identifiable. And then again, that geometric emphasis on genitalia, that triangle that represents the pubis. This figure was made from hematite, which is a very hard but very brittle stone. And like the Venus in Willendorf, it is extremely small, only about 2 inches high, probably, again, a highly portable object. Another sculpture that comes down to us is the head of a woman from Bresson-Puy in France, probably made between about 25,000 to 20,000 BCE. This object is made from carved ivory. And what's so fascinating about this object is we do see a bit of emphasis on the facial features. It would have been painted, yes, but the features of eyes and a nose are carved directly into the face. We also have an emphasis on a pretty elaborate either hairstyle or headdress. And what I love about this is that it seems very similar to that circular pattern that we see on the hairstyle or headdress of the Venus of Willendorf. So just to sum up, this shows us that some of the objects that come down to us happen to be of women, of figures of women. This doesn't mean that's all there was. This just happens to be what exists, or perhaps what art historians have chosen to emphasize. But I think it does show us that this was a motivation for making objects, that women possessed a perhaps supernatural power for the creation of life, represented fertility, and this was very important to subsistence and the continuation of culture in the prehistoric era.